All right, well, hello, friends and colleagues, and welcome to today's panel discussion. So what is ocean-based carbon dioxide removal anyway, and how does it relate to ocean acidification? The event today is being co-hosted by the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification alongside the Ocean Foundation. And my name is Jessie Turner, the director of the OA Alliance, and I am delighted to be your facilitator today and grateful for your engagement, as I'm also personally looking forward to learning a little bit more about this topic. And for context, we know that atmospheric CO2 or carbon dioxide levels have reached historic unprecedented levels, and that projections for the end of this century indicate that our global ocean's surface waters could be 150 times more acidified than pre-industrial levels. And the Alliance's mission, as many of you know on the line, is to increase ambition for climate action and transform planning and response to climate change by accounting for ocean and coastal effects and incorporating resilience building strategies. And while we know that reducing CO2 emissions is the #1 action that is needed to combat ocean acidification, additional strategies may be needed to assist carbon sequestration and advance these response strategies to adapt and build resilience. And a new report by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine outlines 6 ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, as we'll start using the acronym from here on out, 6 different CDR approaches that are in need of further research and development, and that these approaches can be understood as a broader land and ocean-based CDR research agenda that will be needed to help meet the goals set forth in the Paris Climate Agreement. So today's panel discussion is going to provide just a very high-level snapshot of the activities related to prioritizing and advancing research around ocean-based CDR, and specifically explore how some of these proposed strategies are going to relate directly to OA mitigation and remediation. So we have 75 minutes set aside. I'm sure it will go very quickly. And so just to dive right into some of our discussion, I'm thrilled to introduce today's panelists and participants today. We have Matthew Eisman, co-founder and CTO of Ebb Carbon and associate professor at Stony Brook University. Now, you can raise your hand or wave. How's that? We've got Dr. Jess Cross, oceanographer with NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, with a focus on carbon and biogeochemistry and ocean acidification. We have Ramani Webb, associate research scholar at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, and also a committee member putting together this particular report from the National Academy. We've got Brad Ack, executive director of Ocean Visions, Mark Spalding, president of the Ocean Foundation, and Sarah Cooley, Dr. Sarah Cooley, director of climate science at Ocean Conservancy. And panelists, thank you for being here. I know your time is valuable, and really just setting the context that this is a beginning of a much longer, broader discussion, and really meant to provide a common touchstone of information and pose some interesting questions that we will all be navigating together over the next several years. So with that, Sarah, I'll just dive in very high level, start with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about ocean-based CDR at a high level, specifically how much CO2 might CDR be able to remove from the ocean versus what IPCC reports tell us might be needed to keep warming below 2 degrees? And broadly, can you just help us think through the difference between removal versus sequestration?
Okay, it's a lot. Thanks, Jessie, for having us. This is going to be fun. So the Paris Agreement has set the global goal of limiting warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius to preserve the ecosystems that support equitable human development. So UNEP's last analysis says we're on track to warm 2.7 degrees C by 2100. And the December report released by the IPCC Working Group 1 says that warming of about 2 degrees by 2050 is most likely. So the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees C pointed out that pathways to 1.5 C that have no or limited temperature overshoot all require 100 to 1,000 gigatons, and gigatons is 10 to the 9th, so a lot, of carbon dioxide removal over this century. And 2015 National Academy's report on climate intervention estimated the necessary rate to achieve then of removal would be 10 to 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by the middle and end of the century, respectively. Because the ocean naturally acts as a sink for carbon dioxide, it begs the question of whether enhancing this function would meaningfully remove atmospheric carbon dioxide. Now, the recent National Academies report evaluated the state of knowledge about ocean CDR and laid out a research plan. And in that report, they looked at the scalability of 6 major types of ocean CDR and found that ideally, after different degrees of technical development, each one might remove more than 0.1 gigaton to 1 gigaton of carbon per year. The upside of enhancing the ocean carbon dioxide sink is that we would avoid the planetary feedback where the land and ocean would re-emit anthropogenic CO2 to the atmosphere after direct removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Some ocean CDR methods can also locally help with ocean acidification, but there are also some potential downsides to ocean CDR. None of these techniques are confirmed to actually draw down atmospheric CO2, which is global mitigation goals worthy. Removing ocean from the upper ocean with a lot of these techniques then relies on physical processes that could allow more air-sea transfer of CO2 into the ocean. And scaling and verification of ocean CDR methods still are big challenges. We need to know more about the environmental and social consequences of any of these techniques. We also need to resolve whether removing these relatively small amounts of CO2 via the ocean with methods that predominantly store carbon for several decades to centuries is worth it, given the costs and the risks. So you've probably heard about the Orca plant in Iceland that's already online, capturing CO2 directly from the air. It captures 4,000 tons of CO2 per year out of the air. My colleague David Ho calculated that if global CO2 emissions is 38.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year, the Orca DAC plant is like a time machine that takes us back 3 seconds every year. So the scalability challenges that are associated with really any type of carbon removal really underline to me that treating the symptoms is much less effective than curing the disease of too much emissions. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. And it's good to see the putting ocean CDR in context for meeting goals of Paris and figuring out, again, sort of what is the role, what is the scale, what is the potential. And that's what we're here to chat about. And Mark, I just want to, before we get into more of the specific details of some of the strategies, as president of the Ocean Foundation, the mission of the Ocean Foundation is to reverse the trend of destruction on our ocean environments, but also to, you also host an international OA initiative, and you also work to raise ambition for urgent action to address climate change. And before we get into sort of the more technical aspects of the strategies and viability and potential impacts of sequestration removal opportunities, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what I've kind of been hearing in my world around this notion of mission deterrence or moral hazards, which I understand to mean how can we advocate for these types of strategies to remove carbon from the ocean or the atmosphere, but also continue to keep up ambition for reducing current and future emissions of current and future greenhouse gas emissions. So, how do we work through offering or moving forward on some of these removal strategies, but further incentivize ambition for climate action, as Sarah notes, the root cause. Oh, and you're muted.
And how about if I unmute first?
There you go.
Jesse, thank you very much. And this is a critical question. You mentioned in your introduction that the most important thing we can do to address climate change and ocean acidification is to address the drivers. Reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the case of OA, also reducing nutrient pollution in the ocean, etc. And one of the concerns that is constantly raised about the effort and the political will and the individual will to do those things against the drivers is whether there's some technological fix or some easy solution that is out there that's going to, oh, well, we don't have to make these sacrifices after all. And that's what is known in, literature as a moral hazard, right? That you stop doing something you need to do because you think there's going to be some, saving grace out there. We're all looking at these activities. There are basically 3 nature-based solutions, a couple of enhanced nature-based solutions, about 3 mechanical chemical solutions that potentially could take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Some of them could take it out of the water column, which for those of us talking about ocean acidification are most important. And if those things are possible, we should research them. If they're real, we should do them. And the issue is we have to make sure we're communicating in such a way that we avoid this hazard, this moral hazard, that we have this solution that means we don't have to deal with the drivers when there is no question. But the most important thing we can do, the best thing we can do, is switch from fossil fuels to electric and other means of preventing the further emission of greenhouse gases. That won't deal with the legacy that's already out there. We got to figure that out too. But the most important thing we've got to do and concentrate on and not lose attention on is reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the first place.
No, thanks, Mark. And I'll ask, we have a little bit of time if one other person wants to jump in, or if anyone else wants to add anything, and specifically touching on the thing you just said last, Mark, which is, related to ocean acidification and global projected trends. We know that even if we cut emissions today, right, we still sort of have this materialization of ongoing trends of ocean acidification. And so how do we address this message, which is very nuanced, that we need to both reduce emissions and be thinking about ways to remove carbon from the system? Anyone else want to add their thoughts on that particular message? Brad, go ahead.
I just, first, thanks, Brad Ack with Ocean Visions. I want to actually just ask a challenging question. The driver is what is already in the atmosphere. Until carbon dioxide is emitted, it's not a driver. As soon as it's emitted, it's a driver, right, of the things that you're talking about. So I don't know how we can call carbon dioxide in the atmosphere a symptom. It's clearly what's driving the change. And to use that sort of analogy of the time machine, 99.9% of the impact caused to our biosphere every second is what's by CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. So I think we need to reframe that discussion. Clearly, emission reduction is important, but it's no more or less important than cleaning up the legacy pollution, because it's the combination, it's the single number, which is atmospheric concentration of CO2. That's our enemy. That number is going up every day, every month, every year, until we start bringing that. Anything that brings that number down, in my opinion, is a valuable tool.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks, Brad. And I think this hits on sort of, again, this messaging component in addition to some of the actual strategies that we'll be getting into now and learning a little bit about, and how, from my perspective with the Alliance, but just sort of as a community of practitioners, how we think about framing this discussion and continuing to think about those messages to both policymakers, but to a general public, and how we do that in a as clear way as possible. I think will be an ongoing dialogue, certainly. Romani, I want to turn to you just to get now a little bit deeper into the specifics of the strategies that we're talking about. What is Ocean CDR anyway? So Mark mentioned some of these already, but you were on the actual report committee preparing the report. Can you enumerate the primary ocean CDR strategies that were explored in the national report? And further, can you just give us a little bit of context around what metrics or through what lenses these strategies were generally assessed? And just super high level, what are the 6 strategies and how did we think about evaluating them?
Sure. And thanks, Jesse, to you and the team for hosting the webinar today and for inviting me to participate. It's already an interesting discussion. So the statement of task that the committee was given directed us to consider 6 ocean CDR approaches, 4 approaches that are sometimes referred to as like biotic approaches, and 2 that are sometimes classed as abiotic approaches. So the biotic approaches, we looked at ocean fertilization. So, you know, very basic terms, adding micronutrients like iron or macronutrients like nitrogen to the surface water with the goal of stimulating phytoplankton growth that uptake carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. We also looked at a second technique, artificial upwelling and downwelling, which again, very simple terms, uses sort of large vertical pipes to cycle water between the surface and the ocean. So we're talking about upwelling or bringing up to the surface cooler, nutrient-dense water, again, to stimulate phytoplankton growth. And you can also downwell surface water and therefore carbon dioxide into the deep ocean, or carbon into the deep ocean. We also looked at seaweed cultivation, so the purposeful growing of kelp and other macroalgae that uptake carbon dioxide as they grow and store it principally in biomass, which could, in theory, then be sunk into the deep ocean for sequestration. And then the fourth sort of biotic approach that we looked at was a broader category that was classed as ecosystem recovery. So thinking about protecting and restoring fish, whale, and other animal populations, restoring ecosystems like kelp forests that naturally take up carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. The 2 other sort of abiotic approaches that we looked at were ocean alkalinity enhancement and electrochemical ocean CDR approaches. So ocean alkalinity enhancement, fairly familiar to some of the people on the call, basically involves adding alkalinity to ocean water. We focus specifically on the addition of alkaline rock to ocean water. And then on the electrochemical side, we looked at sort of electrochemical approaches that either generate alkalinity that can be added to water or that remove carbon dioxide from water, so-called carbon dioxide stripping. The committee was really looking at basically sort of whether assessing the potential for each of those approaches to contribute to sort of broader climate mitigation efforts. And so we evaluated the different approaches against sort of 9 key criteria. I won't talk about them in detail, but basically we looked at what we classed as the knowledge base. You know, how much do we already know about these different techniques? Are the techniques entirely theoretical? Have they been tested either in the lab or the ocean? What was the scale of the studies, et cetera? And then we looked at efficacy. So given what we currently know, the current knowledge base, how confident are we that the approach will actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and result in increased carbon storage in the ocean? We looked at durability, so how long is that storage? Scalability, how much carbon dioxide could be removed if we implemented these techniques at a global scale. And then we sort of looked at other factors that could affect deployment. So things like environmental risks, which Sarah touched on, also co-benefits. So some of the approaches could help address ocean acidification. Some of them could have economic or other benefits that we looked at. Also social considerations. So things like the governance framework, the legal policy framework, environmental justice, climate justice type considerations. Costs both of the technique itself and of all the associated monitoring, both for carbon removal and for potential environmental or other impacts. And then finally, other resource needs. So, you know, does a particular approach have large energy requirements? Does it require other materials? Really to start to get at that issue of sort of the life cycle impacts of these different approaches.
That's great. I really appreciate that rundown. That's a lot. So as we can see as a community and an audience, there's a lot of factors to consider across a lot of different strategies. Can you just give me as a layperson, generally I hear the word biotic and abiotic. Can you just give me the quick definition of what those 2 things are?
Sure. And I will preface this by saying I am not a scientist, I am a lawyer.
Good company.
So I apologize in advance to all the scientists out there who think I got this totally wrong, like Jess. But generally speaking, as I understand it, the biotic approaches rely on sort of living things, biota, to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The abiotic approaches don't rely on living things. They're based on sort of physical or chemical reactions or engineered approaches. So the more sort of technological approaches that Mark mentioned earlier.
Great. Thanks, Ramani. Really appreciate that. All right, we're getting more technical. So now we'll turn it over to Jess Cross, or Dr. Jess Cross with NOAA as an OA researcher and current practitioner. Can you help us go a little bit deeper and understand what impact or relationship some of the strategies that Ramani mentioned will potentially have, or how they're linked to OA mitigation? I mean, obviously at the broadest level, we sort of understand mitigation, but also talking about remediation or harmful OA conditions. It seems like simply removing carbon from the water in some locations doesn't necessarily immediately dictate or indicate an increase in pH or a direct improvement in local conditions. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated than that. And I'd just love to hear your perspective on, are there specific CDR strategies of the ones that Ramani mentioned that directly address or remediate OA impacts more than others? Linking it to sort of our purview through the Alliance. And then also, what's your sense of, is there a trade-off between benefits of local deployment versus scale deployment? I think a lot of the messages and a lot of the themes really get at that difference in scale when it comes to mitigation and remediation. So that's a lot, but I'll turn it over to hear your thoughts. I know you think about it.
Yeah. As a scientist, one of my favorite things to do is think about these really kind of interesting thought experiments. And you've posed some really great questions here. So at the top, what I want to start out by saying is that the geochemistry of this problem, especially in the oceans, can be really complex. And a lot of the questions that you asked, the answers are going to vary by method and they're going to vary by region. So the challenge is that the carbon system is based on a number of ballasting properties. Changing one part also changes another part. And in some areas, like the ocean, is very, very sensitive to these minuscule differences. And so even a very small change is going to cause big swings in certain parts of the carbon system. But in other areas, it's just not. And so you're going to have to, conduct a much bigger experiment in order to see even very small changes in, your ability to pull down CO2 from the atmosphere. But this isn't just about, how sensitive the ocean is. It's also about durability. Generally methods that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, may eventually come back into equilibration with said atmosphere just by coughing, that absorbed CO2 right back out. So until there's a lot less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than in the surface oceans, like overall, until we've achieved massive scale CDR, the oceans are going to continue to absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide, and acidification will continue. But there are some methods that address that problem. And I think that gets to the next part of your question, where you were asking about, what methods may be able to mitigate ocean acidification better than others. And, the most promising method, the one that I think about the most in my mind for that specific purpose, for looking at ocean acidification, is known as ocean alkalinity enhancement. You'll hear me refer to it as OAE because I have a lot of trouble saying ocean alkalinization. Get tripped up on the L's in there a lot. But you may have also heard it called ocean liming, but OAE directly uses, some kind of basic materials, whether you're calling it silicate or carbonate or calcium hydroxide, basic here in its alkaline, pH sense, to soak up carbon dioxide in the surface ocean, which then enables the surface ocean to soak up more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this kind of mimics Earth's natural cycle, and is essentially speeding up the exact same reaction that would neutralize ocean acidification over thousands of years. And accordingly, this method is fairly durable, meaning that it can store carbon dioxide for a very long time. And in terms of scale, it's also fairly limitless, given that a good portion of Earth's geology is carbonate or silicate rocks. And we know how it works because this is how the carbon cycles through the Earth's, Earth system already. And the reactions are relatively well understood. And there are some studies out there that suggest that, targeted OAE could help stabilize mean surface pH, at least at present day values, and then substantially increase the ocean's capacity to counteract future acidification. So we can effectively use OAE to put a stop on acidification right now, but maybe going backwards in time is a little bit more difficult. So that then leads to the next part of your question where you were talking about like, should we be targeting local? Should we be targeting global? And it really depends on your purpose here. Like, what are you trying to do? Working on the local scale correspondingly means that you're just going to be working on the local scale. It's small. It correspondingly, there's less surface area, so you draw less CO2 out of the atmosphere. But you could remediate ocean acidification very effectively on that small scale. Whereas if you're talking about how do we remove CO2 from the atmosphere, you have to work at a much larger scale than that. You just need a lot of surface area to draw down carbon dioxide at the rates that we're talking about. So it really just depends on what your goals are. And it also depends on the time frame. Do you want to quickly remediate ocean acidification, or do you want to slowly draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? If you want to do both, you effectively have to employ two strategies at once. You must reduce emissions extremely quickly, and you must engage in CDR extremely quickly. And if you're able to do both of those, again, within the next decade to 20 years, this particular study that I'm citing says you really have to do both at scale extremely fast, and then you might be able to put a pause on ocean acidification. But anything less than that, we're going to have to, consider targeted remediation for this continuing problem.
Thanks, Jess. That was right on the 5-minute mark because you are such a pro and really appreciate that. That's great. The other OA scientists in the room, Sarah, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I think underscoring the questions about, we really need to consider the durability of any of these measures. I mentioned before in the National Academy's report, most of the methods they reviewed stored carbon for decades to centuries. And there's a real active debate in terms of like whether that durability is enough to be counted as carbon storage, or are we just kind of like putting it in the closet and shutting the door for later? There's been a modeling paper by Dave Siegel and a few others that was cited extensively in the National Academy's report looking at durability. And they pointed out that 70% of the carbon that gets stored in the upper 500 meters via biomass or direct injection of CO2 is going to be released in the 50 to 100 year timescale by circulation. Mm-hmm. And because these carbon removal conversations haven't successfully landed on what an appropriate durability target really is, that needs to be worked out to help evaluate feasibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Jess. All right. Well, now we'll do have a couple more questions before we go into diving a little bit more into some of these questions around trade-offs and sort of what's needed to move forward with the research and development agenda. But before we go there, Brad, you are the executive director of an initiative called Ocean Vision, which is working to connect a range of actors, including research institutions, marine resource managers, conservation organizations, investors, entrepreneurs, and governments to collaborate on the development, testing, and deployment of scalable and equitable solutions across broadly the climate-ocean nexus. And importantly, Ocean Visions, you outline carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions as the #1 threat to our global ocean. Can you just tell us broadly, I have a follow-up question for you, but can you just tell us a little bit more about the work at Ocean Vision, specifically around ocean-based climate solutions?
Thanks for the question, Jess. Our thesis based on a lot of research is that the two biggest drivers of change in the ocean are massive overheating and direct carbon absorption. The massive overheating is because 93% of all the heat we've trapped over the last 180 years of burning fossil fuels has ended up in the ocean. That amount of heat is calculated to be something now on the order of 5 Hiroshima bomb-sized bomb equivalents of heat energy in the ocean every second, every minute, every hour, every day. That's how much heat we're driving in, excess heat we're driving into the ocean, which is causing sea level rise and interfering with stratification, affecting oxygen levels, poleward migration of species, melting of ice caps, blinking out of coral reefs, right? That is a massive, massive threat to the future health of the ocean. And it's caused by too much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And the second one, which you all know better than I, ocean acidification. nothing we're doing in the marine conservation community that doesn't reduce that number, those magic numbers of concentration of atmospheric CO2 will affect those two problems, other than to buy some time for certain species in the case of building resilience or marine protected areas. But at the end of the day, the only way you can stop those two problems is by reducing that number. And that's why David Attenborough stood in front of the COP26 and made an impassioned plea for focusing on one thing, which is parts per million. Now we're racing, we're working hard to try to achieve a goal of a 1.5 degree temperature change, which we think is a positive goal. Carbon will be at 460 parts per million at that point in time, a level half again as high as any that humans have lived with on the planet. So that's our goal right now, is to have a planet at 460 parts per million, probably no coral reefs left, no summer sea ice, a highly acidified ocean. That's the plan that we consider to be the good, safe goal. And so, I think we have to disrupt this agenda. This is not a good agenda. Even though it's politically potentially feasible, it makes no sense from an ecological or environmental standpoint. So that's why we've dedicated an enormous amount of effort to trying to figure out how are we going to reverse this number. There's lots and lots and lots of really great people working on stopping the flow. There is less than 1% of that number of people working on cleaning up the mess. We can do two things at the same time. Jessica Cross said it perfectly. We have to do both, and we have to do them quickly. And we're really only working on one. The beauty with your audience is that the second piece actually might also help change the trajectory on ocean acidification. So it's got an enormous co-benefit. So, none of these solutions, as I think has been said, are proven, not a single one. We're investing almost nothing in the research and development to prove them. That is what our position is. We need to massively increase the amount of money going into the research and development of these approaches, which means in water testing, because you can't do it only in a lab, to determine how society is going to get the 100 to 1,000 gigatons of carbon that the IPCC has said is needed just to get to that 1.5 target.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brad. And you answered sort of my second question about the urgency of this matter and engaging stakeholders around these strategies. Do you want to say just in a minute or less, anything about some of the mapping tools or some of the products that Ocean Visions have been putting out to bring people, different stakeholders to sort of the current state and the current need of funding?
Yeah, I would say please visit our website if you haven't, oceanvisions.org/roadmaps, and you will find some roadmaps that we've developed with a broad community of people, including many on this call, for what are the next steps to advance our knowledge around these technologies. And now we are trying to catalyze effort and attention towards those priorities. And as an example, a month ago, we released an RFP with a number of funders, $10 million for the science around monitoring and verification and modeling of ocean alkalinity enhancement and carbon removal. So it's exactly the kind of thing we're trying to do, is draw attention to what the most critical science and engineering and governance and social needs are, and then bring the resources, human, institutional, and financial, to address those problems. And that RFP is just one example, but there's many others.
Great. Thanks, Brad. I appreciate that. And Matt, you've been really patient. So thank you for thank you for hanging out with us today. And you are the co-founder and chief technology officer of something called EbCarbon, a tech company that is working to progress and pilot some of the strategies that are outlined by the national report and initiatives like Ocean Visions through the roadmaps. And I'm just curious, I just wanted to give some examples, of what are we actually talking about here when we're talking about some of the tech development and what people are thinking about and starting to advance around the research and development components. So can you just tell us at a broad level a little bit more about EbCarbon's vision and approach to CDR?
Yeah, of course. And I always want to go after Jess in the future, because she just made my job so much easier. That was really a great description. And also just on some of the points made before on moral hazard, I think that's the point, right? we have to do both. And so the communication is simply that to avoid the worst effects, there's no one solution. And because we have to do it all, there's no moral hazard. So I agree with that. But yeah, Ebb Carbon's approach is really kind of to use the capacity and power of the oceans to address climate change. And it's really by accelerating the Earth's natural processes that Jess was referring to, those natural processes for removing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that natural process is called weathering, and that results in carbon dioxide gas being converted to bicarbonate ions and dissolved in the ocean. The problem for human civilization is that regulation happens on geological timescales, so we don't have that kind of time. So what Ebb is doing is using electrochemistry powered by low carbon electricity and speeding up that process. So we intercept existing salty effluent streams before they return to the ocean, or process seawater directly. And we use electrical energy along with ion selective membranes to separate the salt into acid and base streams. The acid is prevented from returning to the ocean and used for beneficial purposes on land. The base is mixed with the salty effluent or with seawater to a pH of around 8.5, and that pH 8.5 seawater is returned to the ocean. So the effect of that kind of adjustment of seawater chemistry is that CO2 in the atmosphere reacts with the more basic seawater and is stored as additional bicarbonate ions in the ocean. So that's really the same end result as that natural regulatory system that I was talking about. And not only do we get the CO2 removal, but we also get the co-benefit of ocean acidification mitigation. So after the CO2 has equilibrated, the pH is slightly higher than when we started. And in the context of what some others have already talked about today, our approach is basically what would be considered electrochemical ocean alkalinity enhancement. So in terms of the metrics that matter for ocean CDR, the additionality is clear. It wouldn't happen if we didn't do the process. The permanence is basically the lifetime of excess alkalinity in the ocean, which is at least 10,000 years. And our technoeconomics suggest a path to less than $100 per ton of CO2. In terms of risk of harm, that should be low. And in fact, we think the process should be beneficial for marine life, partially due to the OA mitigation aspect. But we're working with partners to design experiments to verify the effect on marine life. And I just, fundamentally, the approach is capable of removing tens of gigatons of CO2 per year. And a vision we think we can achieve is to get to that gigaton scale at less than $100 per ton. But that said, our vision is not a future where we're the only silver bullet CDR approach, because I really don't think such a thing exists. So our vision is really that Ebb Carbon is part of an interacting ecosystem of CDR approaches that include the oceans, but also rocks and soil, plants and air. And all of those approaches are benefiting one another by either co-locating or using byproducts from one as input to the other. And if you think about it, that's actually how natural carbon removal happens in the Earth system, where those systems are interacting. So I think just in terms of the vision of the future, that's probably the optimal way to accelerate these natural processes.
Great. And thanks, Matt. And you touched on this, but I just want to give you a minute or less to extrapolate a little bit further, sort of on the timescales we're talking about. You said geologic timescales. I appreciate that notion of accelerating something from that, but just on the next decade. So in 10 years, where does Ebb Carbon want to be in its work? And I guess implicit in that question is, what are some of the current or more immediate challenges or barriers to sort of that vision over the next decade?
Yeah, so we aim to have our first system operating in the field before the end of 2022, so before the end of this year. So we have our first customer, Stripe, and so we'll deliver on that commitment of carbon removal to them. And then thinking about 10 years, we hope to be approaching the gigaton scale cumulative capacity deployed in 10 years. But just thinking about challenges and potential roadblocks to getting there, we need to verify, we expect it to be beneficial for marine life, but we want to verify that. We need to get the right permits in place, make sure we're doing things safely and kind of making the oceans healthier, and make sure that we sort of scale in a responsible way.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate you joining us, and also happy that Ebb Carbon is an official member of the OA Alliance. And so that grateful for you guys sort of joining the joining the family in that way. So now we've got, just for time check for folks to know, we've got about 25 more minutes, 20 minutes, and we're going to do a little bit now of a lightning round to have a bit more concept around your thoughts and perspectives around how do we prioritize further research, thinking about this regulatory cost and equity aspects of CDR schemes, and what policymakers should be understanding right now about ocean-based CDR. And so, as we've heard from the National Academy report, is really a queue up for helping governments and stakeholders further outline a process for prioritizing this next phase of research and development. And as you heard, and we've touched on today, lots of factors and lots of thoughts about how we choose to prioritize and what we choose to prioritize. And so I want to use this next little section. I have a question queued up for all of you. And I'd say in 2 minutes or less, or no more than 3 minutes, I'd love to hear your thoughts around this particular topic and the question I've queued up. So Jess, I'll start with you. Again, these have been touched on a little bit. We've talked about verifying impact, obviously, and trade-offs between risks and benefits, or quantifying risk further. But what factors do you think need to be prioritized or considered to help direct ongoing research and development from here? What's the most important on top of your list?
3 things that I think we need to be pursuing right now. I'll make it simple. First is definitely MRV, like we've already talked about. We have to be able to
extrapolate. Say that
MRV is monitoring, reporting, and verification. We have to be able to understand how much carbon we're pulling out of the atmosphere and how durably it's stored and what the environmental impacts of that are. MRV is definitely the next, big challenge that we face as scientists. But second, we need to better resolve some of these open questions about governance. Where and when can we get started doing this? Who's responsible for it? What is decisional to who? Who's the body making those decisions? When are they making those decisions? This is also critical for us understanding off-ramps. When do we decide that something is not going to work, or that the hazard of it is too great to pursue it effectively? That open governance question is really, really important. And that leads me to my third point, is that, the National Academies recommended a code of conduct for conducting this kinds of research. And I think both of those are critical components for understanding what that code of conduct looks like. How can we be responsible researchers is also really dependent on what we are capable of measuring. We need to make sure that we do that diligently. And we also need to make sure that we, are complying and supporting sort of this operational governance in order to achieve this as quickly as we know that we need to. So MRV, governance, code of conduct.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jess. Mark, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So I've chatted with you a little bit regarding timescale and how timeliness might inform research and development priorities. Would love to hear you share those thoughts again with this broader audience. Yeah.
So as Brad said, we need to talk about parts per million in the atmosphere, and we need to pull that number down. We need to pull that number down fast. And obviously the driver's piece is something we can all work on. But if we talk about the things that will remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from the water column, we have nature-based solutions that are basically ready, known. We know how they take up the carbon, how it moves into storage, and how it's stored and for how long. Boom. Invest in those, go for it, let's just run. Then we have some of these things like Matt was talking about that I will call enhanced nature-based solutions. Let's research the heck out of those, because they can be, sort of the next up ready for us to begin working on. Our challenge, even with those, is the storage question, as Sarah has already told us. So we need to make sure we figured out how to store carbon that is captured. The third tier is the mechanical and chemical carbon dioxide removal, whether it's from atmosphere or the water column. And here we've got a real challenge, right? We ought to, as Brad and others have said, invest in understanding these. We're probably going to need them. The time scale, however, means that they may not be the first place I would advocate investing a lot of money, right? I would invest money now in them to understand them and begin this process, because it's going to take a long time. If we think about any R&D, whether it's telecommunications, aircraft, computers, getting from the concept to a pilot to past research into experimentation and then beginning to scale up, it takes a very, very long time. And you have to bring the policymakers along with you all the way so that there are the regulatory schemes in place that allow these things to happen, which means as best as we possibly can, understanding of the unintended consequences or other ramifications of any of these things. And so if we need to move fast as we possibly can, as Jessica has said, as Brad has said, to move downwards on our numbers, let's invest heavily in the things we are confident in and begin investing in the things that need to go through this entire process of concept to scale.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, that makes sense from my perspective, but really appreciate the emphasis on that being a major factor when we think about how we prioritize funding and how we think about prioritizing future research and development. Sarah, I know that you've been thinking about this topic a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of the social and equity considerations of weighing ocean-based CDR approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this has been on my mind for a while. I've got a paper in review with 3 social scientists about some of the social considerations associated with ocean CDR, and we just submitted it like 2 days ago, so I'm really excited about it. But it'll be a while till the rest of you see it, unfortunately. Because there's not a lot of evidence about ocean CDR and the social parameters associated with it, we had to look at precedents from other things like other negative emissions technologies, other ocean uses, things like that. And we looked a little bit at the physical characteristics of different ocean CDR techniques, and then finance considerations, risk perception, and environmental ethics. And so it turns out that physical characteristics about those techniques, things like their spatial location or the way that they work, make them subject to different policies. And Romani is much better positioned to expound on that than me. But where those methods occur, how much they cost, and how durably they lock away carbon are relevant for social considerations as well. For example, how different ocean CDR techniques could be financed based on how they work also has implications for who bears risk and who benefits from implementing these technologies. And they also even partially control who can participate in using these technologies. And there are huge equity and justice implications that follow from that. Financing arrangements could also worsen this idea of moral hazard by creating lower urgency to cut greenhouse gas emissions overall. And there's other serious questions about multi-generational risk and benefit and debt, which are really very unresolved right now. In another angle, we also looked at public perceptions and how people interpret new technologies and interventions like ocean CDR, and how this is really connected to risk tolerance overall. And it turns out there's already quite a bit known on how people's values and social affiliations affect how receptive they are to new technology, but how new technologies like ocean CDR cross over with their perceptions of messing with nature or their embrace of authority and trust in institutions and their tolerance for risk in different types of natural environments is an area where we need a lot more understanding, and specifically how that relates to the ocean environment, which has some fundamental differences from doing any of these things on land. And another insight is that the overall impacts of a particular approach to ocean CDR have very much to do with the social, economic, and political contexts. And those affect the ethical context by influencing intergenerational risks and benefits, as well as irreversibility of outcomes. And so here too, the ethical dimensions are really incompletely explored at this time, but there's a whole lot of considerations around those social aspects that are going to really influence implementation of any technical solution.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, look forward to that paper and ongoing discussions with your colleagues and others across this field, and does sort of hit on this community aspect and community engagement aspect, but also the local jurisdiction components that you sort of touched on in some of the policy frameworks. And so, Romani, I appreciate sending this question over to you. I know that your focus has largely been on the legal, regulatory, and policy landscape of ocean-based CDR. And I'm curious to, based upon what Sarah just said, but also some of the other requirements that Matt touched on about licensing and zoning and sort of figuring out the physical where and who is in charge of of certifying some of these projects. Can you share your thoughts on how these factors might inform or are currently informing research development and deployment considerations from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think that there are a lot of sort of legal and regulatory challenges for people wanting to pursue research and down the track, if society deems it appropriate for larger scale deployment. Someone asked in the Q&A if sort of existing legal frameworks are appropriate to enable research. And I think most people working in the field would say that the answer to that is no. We're talking about doing things in the ocean, which are part of the global commons, so effectively a shared resource that all countries have an interest in. And that sort of shared nature of the oceans creates a lot of legal complexity. You have a body of international law governing ocean-based activities, depending on exactly where those activities take place. If they're sort of nearer to shore, you can also have domestic law applying in the US that can be federal, state, and local law. And so you have these sort of overlapping legal and regulatory frameworks. And for the most part, those frameworks, weren't designed to deal with ocean CDR, and in many cases aren't particularly well suited for ocean CDR. In some cases, there might be sort of unnecessary restrictions on research and deployment. In other cases, the legal frameworks and the regulatory frameworks might not appropriately address risks or uncertainties associated with the techniques. So there's sort of a framework that there's a lot of uncertainty as to how it should apply, and there's a lot of sort of complexities in how it will apply. And that has, I think has been, many people in the research field tell me that that's a real impediment to them moving forward with projects in the ocean, which, as Brad said, is really important to test out some of these techniques and fully understand how they work, whether they're effective as a carbon mitigation tool and their unintended consequences. I would just say that I think that Jessica's point about monitoring, reporting, and verification is hugely important. When we think about the sort of policy aspect of ocean CDR, one of the things that we need to think about is, if we do want to do this at scale, how are we going to pay for it? And if we're going to rely on markets or carbon credit schemes or other things like that, then we need to have a good assessment of how much carbon we're actually removing and how long it remains out of the atmosphere for, because all of those things affect the value of that service that's being provided and how much people are willing to pay for it. So I think, her point was spot on. I would also say that, I know I'm probably over my time, but I just want to get in this little plug. I think it's really important that these sorts of sort of legal governance policy issues are addressed now. We can't wait until the science is where it needs to be to make informed assessments about this. We really need to build in the sort of non-scientific component of the research as we're also advancing the science, because those non-scientific considerations will inform sort of how scientific research proceeds and how scientific projects proceed. And we need the results of all of those different types of research to inform sort of larger societal decisions about whether we actually move forward with this. So it's just hugely important that we're sort of embarking along multiple paths right now.
Mm-hmm.
Parallel effort.
Multiple things at once. We can. No, Romani, that's great. I really appreciate that. And I have two more questions. I'm going to go a little bit out of order, one for Matt, one for Brad, and then we'll conclude with our, 1 minute kind of final thoughts or final comments to our participants. And, but I just want to stick on this question of markets and talking about the regulation and even just policy interest to some extent in some assumption that there are markets created by ocean-based CDR. And so Matt, I'd be curious just to hear broadly from your perspective how you're thinking about markets, existing or future markets for carbon removal and sequestration at Ebb Carbon. So obviously there's the sort of what we kind of classically know is like carbon markets relative to sequestration potential, but also thinking about byproducts. So with Ebb Carbon, some of the byproducts that will be created from your particular approach to carbon removal. Can you share in 2 minutes or less just your general perspective of what's needed to facilitate more discussion or kind of more emphasis on the policy mechanisms for or non-policy mechanisms for building out these markets?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess at first, in our economic models, all of the revenue in the business is assumed to come from what is essentially this new voluntary carbon removal market that's been created by the Stripes and Microsofts and their commitments. And for the foreseeable future, there's really a lot of demand there. But it's interesting because all of our economics are assuming value just from the carbon dioxide removal. But in fact, one of our quote unquote byproducts is this co-benefit of ocean acidification mitigation, right? And so we assume no value for it because right now society doesn't really seem to place a monetary value on that ecosystem service. But if you look at the area over which ocean acidification is mitigated, per ton of CO2 removal in our approach, in fact, if we just had a value of 50 cents an acre for OA mitigation, that would give us an amount of revenue equal to what we would get from $100 per ton of CO2. So we would basically double our revenue if we just valued OA, ocean acidification mitigation, at about 50 cents an acre. So that would be huge for us, right? So if as a society we started valuing these ecosystem services, I think that would create a real difference in this area.
Thanks, Matt. That's appreciate that comment. And Brad, this last question to you before we do concluding remarks, although it kind of does sound like to some extent a concluding remark question. So feel encouraged to extrapolate. But from Ocean Vision's perspective, based upon some of the mapping tools, do you set guidance for what you think makes an ocean-based CDR scheme or strategy successful? And just sort of hear from Ocean Vision's perspective, is there anything that you're putting out codifying sort of particular parameters of a successful scheme?
There really isn't because we're still, I think, too early. I mean, we all know that it has to be environmentally safe, which means to me safer than the no action alternative, which is pretty darn dangerous. We know that it needs to be cost effective. We know that it needs to sequester, store carbon for long periods of time. At least on that point, we're thinking at the minimum of 100 years, otherwise it's not worth pursuing, but hopefully significantly more than that. But it's just too early. And so to Jessica Cross's 3 points, I would add massive increase in research and development and field testing, because MRV and governance and none of it matters if we don't actually have things that we're trying at large scales. And right now they're all being tried by entrepreneurs for the most part, by innovators like Matt. And thanks for all those people doing that. Government needs to be in this game in a big way, right? We would have never had a vaccine for COVID in a year if government hadn't invested massive amounts of money in underlying science that allowed for an mRNA vaccine to happen. Same with the internet, same with, you can go on and on and on, right? So the first thing is we really need to scale up research and development. And, we're gonna have to create whatever the right code is that allows people to feel comfortable about that. But we have to weigh it against the no action alternative. And the no action alternative here is not safe. At the end of the day, we have a society has a massive carbon removal mountain to climb. I think everybody here has alluded to that. The only question now is where it's going to come from. And there is no free lunch. There is no free lunch. All of the terrestrial pathways have significant costs to them and potential impacts to humans and nature. There's not going to be any that don't. So we're going to have as much information as we can to be able to make wise choices across that full array. But we're nowhere in having that information, nowhere we're close to where we need to be in having that information on ocean pathways.
Thanks, Brad. And I think we've got about 10 more minutes here. So I think I will end. Really appreciate this discussion, really appreciate everyone's expertise and availability and willingness to contribute. As everyone with the Alliance or associated with the Alliance knows, it's all this kind of voluntary activities that drive us forward in these discussions, and really appreciate it. The question I want to pose to you all before providing kind of next steps for how we can do a summary report out and field some questions from the audience. So want to make sure that you all watching understand that I'll have some process for fielding questions and getting some written responses. My question is, Brad, you kind of touched on, I think I'll call on you first because I think we had a nice call to action there. But my question was, what would you want governments or the general public, if you want to take it that direction, but particularly what would you want governments to know about ocean-based CDR strategies? Or inversely, if it is available to you, if this is something you're intrigued by, is there a call to action? And Brad, I think you touched on it, but I'll give you a minute or less to sort of think about your concluding remarks in that perspective.
I already said, what I see as necessary from the investment perspective. Before you get to investment, CDR has to be a thing, right? CDR is not a thing. We heard it actually in the beginning of this call. We're still placing most of the emphasis on decarbonization when most of the problem, if not all of the problem, is coming from the CO2 that's in the system right now. Getting bigger every second, but nevertheless, that's the challenge. And if we could get governments educated on the fact that carbon removal is a legitimate and important pathway to stabilizing dangerous climate destruction and possibly reversing it, that would unlock massive amounts of new energy and attention. And it would also unlock other institutions. There was just a note in the chat about early career professionals not getting any sort of reward for working in this space. That's because it's not a thing. It needs to be a thing. And I say that sort of, using the slang, but it's really true. We need to make it salient. CDR has to become salient, and we need to work on it as intensely and at the equally as we're working on turning off the tap.
All right, thanks, Brad. Romani, over to you. Thoughts on any, particular things you'd want governments to know about ocean-based CDR?
Well, I think for governments, I broadly agree with Brad. I think it's really important, going back to the conversation we had earlier about moral hazard, that people recognize that we're not talking necessarily about a substitute for emissions reductions. It's really a complement to that. And just like on the decarbonization side, we don't just focus on decarbonizing energy systems. We also think about decarbonizing the transportation sector, switching from natural gas to electric heating in buildings. There's a multifaceted approach to reducing emissions. Similarly, there's a multifaceted approach to carbon removal. And we should be sort of looking at all of the options. We're at a point now where the climate crisis is upon us and we need to take drastic action to address it. And so, we really need to pull out every tool we have. So I think that, government should really be taking a broad approach to their sort of climate mitigation strategies, looking at both emissions reductions and removals, and looking at the full suite of removal approaches. The other thing I would say is more directed at sort of the practitioner community, and that is both sort of the more academic researchers and also the people like Brad mentioned, the sort of innovators that are actually sort of pushing the field forward. It's really important that as you all are thinking about sort of the scientific questions, you're also thinking about the governance and social questions, because sort of social issues around social acceptability, equity, justice, governance will be hugely important to the long-term sort of success of these approaches. It's all well and good to have a scientific technique that works really effectively, but if you can't implement it because you can't get the permit you need, or there's extensive community opposition, it's no use to us. So really, again, thinking about those sort of broader social governance and related issues up front is hugely important for that practitioner community.
Thanks, Romani. That's great. And really appreciate you bringing your background on the policy and regulation side to this discussion. Speaking of innovators and regulation, Matt, over to you if you have a specific final remarks you'd like to think from a government perspective.
Yeah, I would ask for three things. I think, first, I would ask governments just take the advice in the National Academies report in terms of funding levels and research priorities. Two, it would be really helpful for governments to develop a unified framework for permitting research and pilot demonstration projects in this field. And then three, just making sure that ocean CDR as a field, these approaches are included in legislation that is intended to catalyze or incentivize carbon removal, right? So if we have legislation that's intending to do that, just to make sure that ocean CDR isn't left out.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And Sarah, I see you nodding along with sort of this mix of social policy, political science stuff. Over to you.
Thanks. I mean, I think it's the climate crisis is way too urgent to get this wrong. And, you know, oceans may indeed contribute part of the global mitigation story, but it's still really early days to even tell how much when it all is said and done. It's important to remember, though, that if we don't ultimately implement scaled up ocean CDR, it's not that we're doing nothing. We're still doing a lot globally on mitigation. So we need to get to that point of being able to make that informed decision. We really need that multidimensional research on the social and the technical aspects and how they intersect with existing ocean uses and human pressures that won't stop, like the need for equitable human development and inevitable climate change that we're locked into. And then we also just really need to keep the pressure on for swift and ambitious mitigation as sort of like the landscape on which all of this activity happens. Thanks.
No, thanks, Sarah. Thank you for joining us today. And Jess, I'll turn it over to you. Final thoughts.
Sure. So, you know, based on the conversation that we've had today, that's been really lively and engaging, the thought that I would leave everyone with is that scaling CDR is about public trust. So in order for society and for markets to really engage in CDR, to make it a thing, as Brad was saying earlier, we need to be collecting data that the public can trust, and we need to be getting decisions from institutions that the public trusts. And we need to be trying to do that on a timescale that the public does not trust. Look at what happened with the global COVID-19 vaccine rollout. It's really challenging to do anything quickly in a way that makes people think that you've done your job. But if we can do that, if we can educate people and help, you know, really work as hard as we can to maintain the public trust, I think markets will understand that they can value and insure carbon assets, which will help make the market a thing. And the public will start to be able to see that that there is documented impact, that this really is doing what it says it's going to do. And so that would be what I leave everybody with. We have to be doing everything that we can on the science and the governance and the market side to make sure that we can trust the results that we're actually looking for.
Thanks, Jess. Really appreciate you contributing today and bringing your perspective from.
Thanks for having us, Jesse.
Yeah. And last but not least, Mark, I wanted to give you the final thoughts. You both as Ocean Foundation as a co-host of this event, but also you being very generous and helping me get up to speed on this particular topic. Would love to give final thoughts over to you.
Thanks very much. And I'll join Jesse in thanking all of you for joining us today and being part of this. Has been a really fabulous discussion. I want to point out that one of the most important things that we've heard, whether it's talking about more R&D investment or more investment in development of policy or incentives for the private sector, et cetera, we're talking about money. And we've had a system of government in our country that has consistently cut taxes and therefore government budgets over and over again. Therefore, we're talking about a reduced pot of money that we're fighting over here, and I believe it's resulted in the United States and other countries who have done this sort of system losing leadership on technology, losing leadership on research and development, losing leadership on opportunities for the future. And I think that goes hand in hand with the amount of resources we don't have available to have the government play an active role in dealing with climate change in general, with this as one of many arrows that need to be in our quiver. So a bottom underlining piece here that I want to emphasize is we have to get the government to recognize the problem that has been created by starving the government of the capacity to do what it has historically done, and being unwilling to agree that this problem exists, being unwilling to throw the resources at addressing this problem that is needed. This is, Brad said, ocean CDR has to be a thing. This National Academy study was the third one, right? This is not the first time that we on the Ocean Studies Board and others have brought this up. This is there. The governments who signed off on the IPCC report that mentioned carbon dioxide removal and other technologies know this is a thing, right? This exists in the minds of governments. They're just not putting the resources into, whether it be, my preference for the upfront expenditures on nature-based solutions and enhanced nature-based solutions, and the longer term examination. Maybe we'll find out some of these things don't even work, right? Let's quickly get to that point and throw them aside and prioritize the others that do work. Maybe we find out that, storing carbon is so damn impossible when we've captured it artificially that we can't go forward, right? How do we get there if we don't spend money? And we can't spend money if we don't have money. And we don't have money because we keep cutting taxes and starving the capacity of our society to even begin to address its problems.
Well, appreciate your remarks, Mark, and really appreciate everyone being here today for this discussion. It's been a delight, honestly, a privilege to work with everybody on this screen and everybody watching and joining us remotely. So I think what I will suggest, we've heard, just to recap quickly the themes, we've talked about systems for prioritizing research and funding, talking about assessing risk and viability, timescale, social, economic, political considerations, proactive policy and regulation, building markets. But I think underpinning all of this we've talked about is messaging and building trust. And I really appreciate, Jess, you bringing that second element into the messaging component, because it's super important. And I think that's where we'll be going as a community to think through how we talk about this and how we create meaningful discussions across the right set of actors, including governments and other funders. So really appreciate everybody bringing this discussion together. The other thing that we all have in common is this sense of urgency. And I think the most recent IPCC reports, particularly focusing on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptability, are more than sobering. And I think everyone in this space knows the urgency involved, and so appreciate everyone's contribution. For those of you at home, please continue to stay on the line if you'd like. Type some questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box. I will farm them and we'll do a written, high-level written summary report from this discussion. We'll make the video recording available, and then I'll also try to assign some of the questions to our panelists and get some written responses if that seems appropriate. So thank you all, really appreciate the dialogue, and I'm sure we will continue to stay in dialogue and in partnership as we go forward this year.
Thanks to you too, Jesse, for putting together this panel and really walking us through a really interesting discussion today. So appreciate it.
Yeah, nice job, Jesse.
Thanks.
Thanks. I learned from the best, and that means all of you, truly.
Bye.